Platforms like Facebook and Uber have really grown at a very fast pace, and today they've transcended their initial roles as being mere facilitators of economic transactions to become very, very important elements of modern societal fabric. When there is market power, there is always the scope of abuse of that power, and therefore regulators are chipping in because they want to minimize the abuse of power in these settings. We need to be mindful that any regulation should not disrupt the innovation that these platforms have brought about, and we should remember that platform-based models are very different from conventional markets. And secondly, also the fact that it's not the mere power itself which is problematic, but rather it's the misuse of power, and therefore regulation should be targeted at curtailing the misuse of power rather than the power itself. There is mixed evidence, but we see clearly that the leaders are some of the most innovative firms today, and they're not just innovating a lot, but rather most of their innovations are also open source, because of which they are not just innovating themselves but also spawning an entire ecosystem of innovation. For instance, Google has open sourced its entire Android platform, because of which we see so many variants of Android, and it's really spawned an entire ecosystem that would not have existed otherwise. So one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of startups and an entire ecosystem of startups had spawned with the very idea of being acquired by these firms. So for these startups, the idea was never to compete with Facebook, but rather they just wanted to be, being bought by Facebook was the most viable exit strategy for them. And if regulations impose a blanket ban on acquiring competitors, then we may not have seen that entire generation of startups. So broadly, what you have to keep in mind is that the digital economy is very fundamentally different, and any regulation should not just target the development of power itself, but rather the abuse of power. For instance, Amazon started off as a very neutral marketplace, but what's happened over time is that Amazon has had access to a wealth of data about what kind of products sell and what kind of prices are optimal, and Amazon has been using that kind of data to launch its own product line and is in turn competing with its own sellers. Similarly, we see in the case of food delivery platforms like Swiggy, where they have data on what kind of food and everything else that people are ordering. They know where the demand is coming from, and they're using this data to set up their own kitchens, and they're competing with restaurants, and in many cases they're not even sharing these data with the restaurants. We're increasingly seeing regulatory pushes like the data protection bill that came out recently, and these bills, they impose a lot of compliance costs because in many cases it may force some people to reinvent their business model. But it's important to keep in mind that the biggest firms have a lot of manpower and funds, but it's some of these smaller firms who are likely to face the biggest burden, and we need to make sure that any regulation in the space, while it protects the consumers, it should not come at a cost of the smaller firms.